The US Senate Intelligence Committee just released a report detailing that COVID-19 virus was most likely created in Wuhan lab, and then a modified dangerous strain leaked out and infected the rest of the world, giving us this.
Shortage of beds and equipment.
And more than 500,000 people worldwide,
more than 11 million people,
have lost their lives.
Estimating that 15 million deaths globally.
You should not go out and you should stay at home.
The World Health Organization has officially called it COVID-19.
What was considered a conspiracy theory is beginning to come up as the likely root cause, with scientists all over the world supporting it as fact. Worst part of this all, the leading expert who said that lab leak theory was a hoax, this guy, he is being paid by the CCP. His organization actually gets millions of dollars from CCP to perform research at the Wuhan lab, the same lab that probably leaked COVID-19. So no wonder the CCP doesn't want people investigating the lab leak theory.
The biggest question here regarding the virus, where did it come from?
Wuhan Virology Institute.
The coronavirus pandemic is believed to have started.
The virus leaked out of a laboratory.
Highly secured and highly controversial lab.
You think it's possible this virus was engineered within that lab and leaked?
Now, let me make this straight. Before YouTube tries to delete my channel, this video is meant to go deeper into where and how the COVID-19 virus started, shedding light on facts that were discovered in the Intelligence Committee's report. I'm not here to throw out any conspiracies that will spread misinformation. I'm just reporting information that was found through US Senate Intelligence Committee's reports. Even then, I have a little fear that this video might get suppressed because of the nature of this topic, so it would help me a lot if you guys scroll down and hit that like button. In recent history, nothing has left as big a stain on the world as COVID-19. In fact, many of us didn't know that outside of flat-out military war, there was anything else that could bring the world to a halt. Well, technically, I guess COVID-19 was a biological war though, so yeah. What's puzzling is that despite the devastation that the virus brought to the world, there has been no clear conclusion on where the virus originated from. Just last year, even US President Joe Biden had to order his aides in a special task force just to find answers to the origin of the virus that causes COVID-19, something you think would be public knowledge by now. Weird, right? What is supposed to be a simple scientific question has been turned into a political question, loaded with ramifications for whichever side opposes the popular theory. In the United States, it almost seemed like a Democrats versus Republicans matter, especially during the Trump administration when the virus began.
The big lie is a lot of bull. That's what it is.
China, they could have contained it. They were either unable to or they chose not to.
How can you stop it?
We're looking at exactly where it came from, who it came from, how it happened.
This is one of the reasons why it is important that we just have an assessment of how this originated.
He even claims to have seen evidence.
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
But since when has science cared for left-wing or right-wing politics? Let's look at this the way it should be looked at, as independent, open-minded thinkers. There are two popular theories on how this virus began. Let's first go over the popular accepted theory and reasons why it's not true. Then we will dig into lab leak theory and what the new report says. Zoonotic spillovers are when an animal disease crosses the species barrier and infects humans. This is a well-known, well-documented natural phenomenon that is alleged to be responsible for 60 to 75% of emerging diseases in humans. This zoonotic spillover phenomenon is what was largely believed to have caused the COVID-19 pandemic. This was especially supported by the fact that coronaviruses, the virus behind the pandemic, are a large family of viruses that cause disease in a variety of domestic and farmed animals and have been responsible for previous outbreaks of new diseases in humans. The fact that all coronaviruses known to infect humans are the result of natural zoonotic spillover from animals into humans made this the popular theory back in 2019 and 2020 at the height of the pandemic. Two recent and prominent examples include severe acute respiratory syndrome, also known as SARS, and Middle East respiratory syndrome, also known as MERS, is caused by a coronavirus that leads to severe respiratory disease in humans. To further add fuel to the fire, almost every infectious disease pandemic, with the exception of the 1977 Russian flu pandemic, is believed to have natural zoonotic origins. This natural zoonotic spillover hypothesis is a plausible explanation for how the COVID-19 pandemic started. When the virus started, this theory was accepted as all but fact. At the beginning, even I thought that the virus had come from bats, passed through pangolins, and then onto humans, all this happening in the wet markets of China.
China's wet markets have delivered yet another disease.
The virus may have jumped from exotic animals to humans.
How dangerous are zoonotic diseases?
Transmission of pathogens from animals to humans.
Scientists say they have compelling evidence to back that claim.
The virus originated from a market in Wuhan, China, from a pangolin.
That's led to growing calls to ban wet markets.
This narrative was so widely pushed and accepted as the news media ran with it as not as theory, but as fact. In all journalistic integrity, there was reasonable evidence to accept this. The first solid piece of evidence to bolster the natural zoonotic origin argument was the fact that about 33% of the earliest known human COVID-19 cases were all somehow associated with the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. This made it seem like Huanan seafood market in Wuhan was ground zero for the outbreak. Secondly, several animal species susceptible to the coronavirus strain thought responsible for the pandemic were sold alive and in poor animal welfare conditions at the very same market. For most, it was simply a matter of putting 1 and 2 together. However, when you zoom into this theory, you begin to find flaws in this argument. Now, even though this theory is what has been accepted as fact for so long, I find myself having doubts. These doubts emanate from the facts that have come up, debunking this theory, or at the very least, showing that it is not absolute. These are facts that US Senate Committee on Health Education, Labour and Pensions put together just last month. They make this whole COVID-19 situation more interesting in regard to the origins. You see, based on precedent and genomics, COVID-19 has been believed to have crossed over the species barrier from an intermediate host to humans, with the general belief being that there was a bat-to-human spillover. The truth, however, is that this is no more fact than any other theory out there, as there is no critical evidence that would prove this true. The facts about the pandemic being caused by a natural zoonotic spillover are simply missing. Hold on. Before you riot in the comment section, let me explain the gaps that lie in the theory as reflected through the Senate's research. Firstly, the intermediate host species for the coronavirus, if one exists, remains unidentified. A quick look on the website of the National Center of Biotechnology Information shows you this. Yes, the intermediate host isn't pangolins, as mainstream news has reported. That host species is still quite unknown after 3 long years. By comparison, within 6 months of the first known human case of SARS, public health officials in China found SARS infections in palm civets and raccoon dogs in live animal markets in Guangdong province. Fishy, isn't it? Secondly, unlike SARS, the genomes of early COVID-19 cases from the first months of the pandemic do not show genetic evidence of the coronavirus strain having circulated in another animal species other than humans. Even at the ground zero sites in the Wuhan wet market where the animals reportedly infected humans, none of the animals tested were infected with the SARS-CoV strain, according to presentations by PRC officials to the World Health Organization. Thirdly, the SARS-CoV strain's high binding affinity for human receptors suggests that it is possible for it to directly infect humans without needing a period of adaptation in an intermediate host whatsoever. This limits the chances of their having had the natural zoonotic spillover. Also, while direct bat-to-human spillover of coronavirus has never been confirmed to cause a human outbreak, it is theoretically possible, and there is circumstantial evidence suggesting it may occur under limited specific circumstances. But in a practical setting, the chances are extremely low. Even lower are the chances that the outbreak would start in central China and not southern China where the bats reside. More on that later. Lastly, based on the available evidence, Wuhan is the only location where the SARS-CoV strain spilled over into humans. What then makes it odd is that just after the unidentified source transmitted the virus to humans, it stopped transmitting the virus. This is at odds with the precedent of the 2002-2004 SARS epidemic, where infected palm civets continued to transmit the virus to humans and to raccoon dogs. Because if we're being frank, why did the transmission stop? Why was it a one and done type of situation? If the COVID-19 pandemic is the result of a zoonotic spillover from an intermediate host of the SARS-CoV strain, the virus would be expected to continue to circulate in the infected intermediate host population, creating the potential for additional independent spillovers into humans and other animals as well. Assessing these factors and the available evidence put forward for the spillover theory, I'm sure you can clearly see the inconsistencies with both historic precedent and the scientific understanding of how natural zoonotic spillovers of respiratory viruses like SARS-CoV-2 occur. This pokes holes into the bats to humans Wuhan wet market theory that the mass media has run with. From a logical perspective, although we don't dismiss the theory entirely, in the absence of missing conclusive evidence, it's difficult to support the natural zoonotic origin hypothesis. What then does that leave us with? Well, let me introduce you to theory number 2. This is where the controversy heightens. This theory, once disputed as hogwash and conspiracy, has now turned the tide to become the likely dominant theory in the root cause of COVID. The lab leak theory suggests that COVID-19 was due to human error that leaked the virus from a lab and unleashed it onto the world. Let me give a background for this so that you can understand why this theory has gained so much traction, especially recently. In the aftermath of the 2002-2004 SARS epidemic, Chinese authorities emphasized research on potential pandemic pathogens, including SARS-related coronaviruses, to develop vaccines and other medical countermeasures with the goal of attempting to predict and prevent the next coronavirus pandemic. They built a facility and turned Wuhan into a global hub of coronavirus research. The Wuhan Institute of Virology is China's premier coronavirus research institute, matched by only a handful of places worldwide. WIV researchers and their collaborators undertook large-scale virus collection expeditions to southern China and Southeast Asia, where bats naturally harbour SARS-related viruses on an annual basis from 2004 onwards. During these expeditions, scientists collected bat blood, saliva and urine samples, allowing them to have hundreds of samples of variations of coronaviruses. It's here where the problem starts. The lab leak hypothesis points the finger at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which, by the way, is close to the Huanan seafood market where the first major cluster of infections occurred. The institute has a long history of collecting and analysing bat coronaviruses. The generally popularised leak scenario usually goes something like this. It involves researchers tinkering around with the virus to investigate its properties, perhaps in gain-of-function experiments in which pathogens are modified to be more harmful in a bid to understand them better. This modified virus then somehow slipped through the lab's biosafety net, which has been criticised several times by many for being full of holes. From there, the world is infected and we have coronavirus as we know it. The lab leak theory is now so serious that the World Health Organization and US intelligence are both taking the hypothesis seriously. Just coming from a logistical perspective, what are the odds that a deadly virus breaks out in a city where there is a giant lab known to specialize in housing variants of the said pandemic virus? To add to that, there is a significant absence of evidence pointing to the virus having been transmitted by animals at all, meaning it likely passed from humans to humans the whole time. Add to that the fact that the blamed Wuhan wet markets were animal COVID free, as the animals there did not carry the alleged strain of the virus. Lastly, add again the fact that Chinese authorities have been adamant in refusing access to the lab for international parties or observers in pursuit of truth. In fact, anyone who has voiced out the lab leak theory, individual or nation alike, gains the wrath of the communist nation. Just ask Australia, who got sanctioned by China for it, if you don't believe me. The question becomes, is this all a coincidence? What has China got to hide? It all starts to seem less like a conspiracy and more like fact. For those who will point out that bats carry various coronaviruses and that they could have started it by transmitting it to humans, I pose this question to you. The bats that carry various coronaviruses are based in southern China. Absent human intervention, how then did this virus travel 1,000 miles only to emerge in Wuhan, which is in central China, without having infected the other regions in the process? Had the pandemic started in southern China, the zoonotic spillover theory would have credibility, but because it started in central China in Wuhan, we raise questions. Even Sir Jeremy Farrar, director of the Wellcome Trust, Europe's biggest philanthropic research funding body, notes in his best-selling book Spike, it was odd for a spillover event from animals to humans to take off in people so immediately and spectacularly in a city with a biolab, which is home to an almost unrivaled collection of bat viruses, especially with a new virus that seemed almost designed to infect human cells. If this were a coincidence, he adds, it would be a huge one. The Senate Committee on Health Education, Labour and Pensions wrote in their report, nearly 3 years after the COVID-19 pandemic began, substantial evidence demonstrating that the COVID-19 pandemic was the result of a research-related incident has emerged. A research-related incident is consistent with the early epidemiology showing the rapid spread of the virus in Wuhan, with the earliest calls for assistance being located near the WIV's original campus in central Wuhan. It also explains the low genetic diversity of the earliest known SARS-CoV-2 human infections in Wuhan, because the likely index case would be an infected researcher who is the likely primary cause of the virus in Wuhan. A research-related incident also explains the failure to find an intermediate host, as well as the failure to find any animal infections predating Q19 cases. What makes it even more likely that a lab leak actually occurred is the fact that despite the WIV being a top center for housing viruses and biological weapons to a degree, the place was simply not secure. There is good documentation that reports a host of biosafety failures along with management and training concerns at the virology center. You would think that such a place that has the power to affect mankind would have the top standards of safety and staff, but nope, it's just like your local Walmart. Seriously though, they were notoriously lackluster in safety measures. Documented failures like this predating the pandemic have been listed in various reports since. I've got to ask you, how wild is the lab leak theory now? Well, I don't know about you, but the US Senate Committee on Health Education, Labour and Pensions certainly has concluded that not only is the popularised zoonotic spillover theories not worth considering due to the absence of sufficient evidence, but that the lab leak theory is the likely option for the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not a decision that they have come to easily, but it's certainly the decision that the facts point towards. I think it's time that we understand that the mass media and press have been running with a fed narrative, as they always do, in the absence of proper research and accountability to regular citizens. If there is weight behind the lab leak theory, just like the US Senate Committee on Health Education, Labour and Pensions thinks, alongside several other publications that are now showing up, then we have to ask, why did it take so long for this to surface? In a scientific matter, were all of these options not explored, and all the hypotheses brought to the table in the 3 years that we have been looking for the COVID cause? This is when everything starts getting a little fishy and interesting. In February 2020, an influential letter signed by 27 global experts was published in the Lancet, strongly condemning conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. The letter was basically ruling out the lab leak hypothesis, and because it had 27 experts co-signing it, it gave the illusion of scientific consensus, removing any attention into anything contrary. In late 2020, however, emails released following a Freedom of Information Act request showed that the Lancet statement had been orchestrated by one of the 27 co-authors, none other than Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance. It was also revealed that all but one of the other 26 scientists were linked to the Wuhan lab, their colleagues or funders. Basically, these so-called independent opinions were simply people protecting their interests in the protection of the Wuhan lab and its funders. Basically, there was a massive conflict of interest. Daszak in particular had been first appointed in late 2020 as chair of the task force created by the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, with the aim of establishing none other than the origins of COVID-19, and shortly thereafter as the only US representative to a WHO fact-finding mission to China tasked with the same goal. Unsurprisingly, both task forces found that the virus was most likely zoonotic in origin, and that transmission through a laboratory incident was extremely unlikely. The same result favoured Daszak and his interests. Pretty coincidental, don't you think? Look, I know, the lab leak theory is not without its own faults or critics, but from what's been revealed, it begs to be treated as more than a conspiracy. The whole world was affected and torn apart due to the COVID pandemic, which means you and I are stakeholders in this. I know this video is controversial, and I know it won't be without opposition. It was so controversial that we had another sponsor pull out of sponsoring this video. I never want to avoid a topic because sponsors are unhappy, that's why I've decided to fund my own videos. I just launched a YouTube Basics Academy. This is where I will share everything I've learned about YouTube that has helped me make this channel successful. If you're someone who wants to start out on YouTube, you can learn from my mistakes and hopefully avoid repeating them. You can find more details by clicking the link in the description, and thank you so much for supporting the channel.